Okay. Now, would you agree that packaging and trust are often undervalued catalysts for sustainable revenue growth in the B2B space? Now, probably you're all aware that trust is critical. And research by Nielsen would indicate that 64% of consumers try a new product because the packaging their eye, and 41% continue purchasing a product because they prefer its packaging design. Furthermore, a Harris poll revealed that 82% of shoppers want a brand's values to align with their own, and three quarters have actually parted ways with their brand over a conflict in values. Now, in the B2C space, it would certainly make sense, but in the B2B space, with the complexity of products and services, longer sales cycles, challenges in brand differentiation, as well as perhaps unlimited customer touchpoints, it can prove to be a lot more challenging. Our guest seems to think there is hope for us, and we'll be exploring that on this episode. But first, hello, welcome to the Predictable B2B Success Podcast, brought to you by Sproutwood.com. I'm Vinay Koshi, and our guest is Nathan Yeung. Nathan, you're the founder of Find Your Audience, which offers fractional CMO type services, but is very much focused on delivering pipeline growth, which certainly caught my attention. You've had quite a bit of experience in the marketing space. You're over 10 plus years advising B2B businesses. You've trained as a marketer, but also worked in the finance and management consulting space, which has certainly provided a lot of more depth there. I'm curious, Nathan, given all that you were doing in the past, why Find Your Audience?
It's a good question. One, I think I'm a serial entrepreneur, which means I always like to be a bit busy. And I think if there was one thing that was obvious to me was I get very frustrated easily at the bad advice that some of my founder friends were
Mm,
getting. And it got to the point where I said, I'll help you. I'll do this work for you. Because often they get this advice and it's not well rounded. It doesn't have perspective on a business. It has perspective on a marketing perspective, but it doesn't have overall perspective that I think is mid to long term. And often I see a lot of my colleagues, my good friends who run businesses, take very short term advice and often doesn't yield the results that they want. And I said this in another podcast, I was joking about it, but marketing is a little bit like getting pregnant. And when you're trying to get pregnant, it takes time. Two, when you get pregnant, there's sometimes mistakes that happen or things that happen, and you have to reset. And unfortunately, that means a lot of time and money is spent, and you're never going to
mm.
get that back. And so I think it's really important for people to start off with the best approach. And I just was frustrated seeing so many of my founder friends be, I'm going to say, taken
Mhm.
advantage of. It's my
Okay,
personal opinion.
brilliant. Now, given your journey to date, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
My personal area of strength is likely strategy. And what that means to me is where are you going to play and how are you going to win? And I think the one thing that's very clear, especially in McKinsey studies and Harvard studies, is not often do you see marketing as a function in an organization play a major role in strategy. And I think this is the interesting thing where often the marketing department will have insights where there is white space. And that is not just going to be a thing that they use on a tactical perspective, but could very much be a positioning thing for the entire
Hmm.
organization. And I think marketing does play, or at least I have always found marketing does play a very long-term strategic role. And I think sometimes it gets discounted. So I think that's one area where I play and I love to play in and I do well in because I think that comes also from my finance and my management consulting background. On a tactical perspective, I do a ton of SEO. I test SEO
Mhm.
things all the time. And funny enough, people go, Nathan, why does Find Your Audience not rank well? And I'm like, because I experiment on my own website very aggressively. And I'm going to let you know, sometimes I get put into the sandbox. And that's because if there was going to be a website that I was going to test on aggressively that has domain age and content and some authority, it's going to be my website, and I'm willing to risk that because that's my goal. I need to aggressively test, and a fake blog isn't going to do me justice, especially when a fake blog is not the same as a
A
commercial.
lot's to unpack there, but I'm curious. You mentioned the McKinsey and Harvard studies, but in that area of strength, what else would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
The businesses don't know that everything in marketing works. And I think often companies think that a certain channel or tactic won't work for the business, and I think that's wrong. But they're looking at this entire problem the wrong way. It's not about what works, it's about what's the priority based on your current constraints. And I think that's what a ton of people get wrong about marketing. They forget to think that if everything works, then it's really not about what works. It's really about what is going to be the most effective for your business today, given your financial, human, and time constraints. That's the most important thing. So I find the way people just view marketing as a whole just wrong, and how they approach marketing wrong. And which is very much the reason why I think a lot of companies go down a rabbit hole and realize that they've gone down the wrong rabbit hole. It's a thing that will work for them, but it's not going to work for them today. It's not the best tactic for them.
Just based on what you're saying, would I be mistaken in saying that as marketers, we should almost be like the equivalent of tailors, measure twice, cut once, and given the circumstances of a particular business?
That's a good question. And I'm going to say that's an oversimplification. I refuse to say that any marketing, there are some marketing tactics that I'd be willing to give a 99% level of guarantee. You should absolutely try to measure twice, cut once. Yeah, I think that's what everyone in any part of a business function wants to do. But I think marketing is so complex that when you're building a marketing funnel for the first time, you're going to measure twice, but you're probably going to measure 3 or 4 more times. And that's just because there are things that will come up that you won't recognize. There'll be assumptions that you haven't been able to validate. So, yeah, absolutely. But I think that's an oversimplification. I think, of course, we want to be prudent in our approach, but I don't think there's any way for anyone to be 100% guaranteed.
With packaging, most of us would certainly understand the concept from more of a consumer point of view. For those of us in the B2B space, we're probably thinking, isn't that almost part of branding? So could you clarify what you mean exactly by packaging and if it differs from branding?
I think branding is packaging for B2B. And what I mean by that is like everything that you showcase is the package. And if you think about packaging in just the most simplest of terms, it's a first impression. And in B2B world, our first impression is, I'm going to argue, likely your digital footprint. And I feel like a lot of companies don't recognize that or put enough weight behind that for them to understand that's their version of packaging. Often we'll talk with companies, they're like, oh, we don't need to touch our website, we're getting leads. And they're always thinking too positively about it, which is fine, and I agree with that. But it's often this idea where it's like, you don't know how much you're missing, or you haven't done enough analysis to understand how much people are maybe dropping off and the reasons why they're dropping off. And then there's likely good reasons for them dropping off. It could be the fact that your content is bad, or it could just be the fact that on a first impression basis, they're not impressed. A great example is a software company that we just started helping, and for lack of better words, their website looked like it was from 1995. So in a highly homogenous, highly commoditized business, how is it that anyone's going to believe that you're better and differentiated if your website looks like it's from 1995? It's not going to leave a good impression, and it's going to be harder for your salespeople to close things. So branding, in my opinion, is the packaging for B2B. And if you're not doing great branding, if you're not doing differentiating branding, and you're doing something that's just from Upwork or Fiverr or overseas talent, no offense, but hasn't had any thoughts, doesn't have any brand elements, doesn't have any consistency, no market research has been done for you to actually creatively stand out in the market, your packaging is poor. You are using a wet paper bag to go into the market instead of having a beautiful, luxurious box being presented to you.
I think a lot of people would be thinking about the aesthetics side of things, certainly things like SEO as well. But I would think that we need to go a lot deeper, or at least start within the company itself, maybe even address issues of culture. I'd be curious, given your experiences, how do you address this problem of bad first impressions and address not just the packaging, but perhaps some of the internal ways of thinking within the organization as well?
That's a great question. And when I was a management consultant, one of the things that I was in charge of was change management. And it's top down, right? If I get hired as a consultant and the CEO just wants me to do demand generation and bring in leads, it's going to be really tough for me to get anyone to be bought in with the idea that, hey, when you're on webcam, you need to be using your background. So like, it doesn't make a difference. You're right. It probably doesn't generate a sale for you, but it's the packaging of the brand, right? And there is no easy way for me to get a company bought in with that without the C-suite being bought in with the idea that their first impression is coming off quite poor. Now, how I could do that is if they allowed us to do customer surveys or customer feedback calls, and we actually get anecdotal comments saying, hey, it's nice that so-and-so is on the call and he's being very casual, but it feels very unprofessional. And getting those anecdotal points. But it is really much a top-down approach. And I'll be frank to say that when I work with clients now and during my discovery process and my interview process, if they're not willing for us to touch their creative, I'm actually quite reluctant to work with them because it means that they have this predisposed perspective that creative means nothing to the organization. And that's an uphill battle. So not only am I putting my position in a challenging position, I'm putting my company at risk for having a track record of failure, and I don't want to put that on our business.
You're almost asking for the company to be open-minded to pretty much all your input and insights, and you're backing this up with data and evidence of the problems that are occurring. In terms of bringing this all back and implementing it, I would assume that you would have a strategy in place to address some of the more critical issues before you address, I guess, some of the more surface level issues. What does that look like, that entire process?
It's a pretty intensive process, and different parts of it are shorter and different parts are longer. I would say our discovery process is a minimum of a month. And usually what we're doing that is doing our best based on our current internal process to become SMEs, a subject matter expert in their business. And that's a really heavy download into understanding their industry, understanding the nuances, understanding all of the objection points that they've ever received from their sales, understanding why are we winning sales, why are we losing sales, understanding why we have churn. We go through a lot of detail to figure out what is it that is their business. And I know that sounds simple, but sometimes I have found that the founders or C-suite that we work with have a hard time articulating that, hence why they have a marketing problem. And often we'll work with companies that are very consultative in their approach in sales, which means they don't have standard products, which basically also again means they don't know their product very well. Because I've always said to many of my companies, say just because you do consultative sales doesn't mean you don't have a standard product offering. You likely do. You just haven't had the chance to review that. Once we do that, we do a ton of market research. We're looking at competitors. We're looking at the color palettes that they use. We're looking at their language. We're looking at the frequency of how much they're posting. We're identifying their funnels. We're figuring out what funnels are built out well, what funnels are nascent or very early stage. We look at how much they're spending. We look at their organic. Like we do a lot of work for us to understand, okay, comparative to your competitors, where do you stand in marketing and how far behind are you? And I think that's essentially how we figure out where we want to position them and also advise them on what are going to be high probability tactics. For example, if you're working with a industry where you have one or two main players that are buying the most expensive sponsorship package on every single event, it's going to be hard for you to do well at those events. Rather than trying to compete with them on a sponsorship package, we're going to advise them to do more guerrilla marketing at these conferences because you'll never be able to afford the same amount that they're spending. All of this research all kind of leads towards how we want to position them in the market, which ultimately means what kind of creative is going to be required for them to do that on the tactical.
Okay. Now, trust is essential. Would you say that most CEOs are perhaps a little bit overconfident in their estimation of trust with their customers?
100%. Overconfidence is something that I think is innate in all of us and certainly is quite prominent in C-suite. More often than not, most companies believe that their customers trust them far more than they actually do. And that presents an obvious problem. One, that presents a problem with C-suite buying into marketing activities to build trust. Two, it presents an obvious problem where likely the C-suite is not engaging in their account management or their customer onboarding services or whatever term you want to talk about, but taking care of your customers. They're probably overlooking and not putting enough effort into building those relationships and not recognizing how much opportunity is being left on the table. So totally think that a lot of C-suite are 100% delusional on the percentage of trust that they have from their customers. And that presents all kinds of problems.
To help them make this mind shift, is there perhaps a metric that you're looking for, or perhaps a few metrics that you're looking for in order to quantify the trust that their customers have in a particular brand?
So some will argue that the NPS score is a version of trust, but I don't think that is. I think it's a bit of a fugazi survey. It's a nice metric to measure relatively, meaning not an absolution. It's not you do the NPS and that's your absolute placement in the market. It's more of a relative thing. You want to see if it's trending up or trending down. And that's the indication. The number in itself is meaningless. Because I don't think people answer it very truthfully all the time. Because the reality is there's a difference between referring someone and not referring someone. And my challenge to people is if you want to see if you actually have customer buying, you just ask the honest question, how many customers do you have that want to call you? Not for a problem, just call you. And ask for product updates, ask for the product roadmap, and is actually excited to figure out more about what you're doing. That's more of an indication of how many people trust you than an NPS score. And I'll give you a great example. When we do a discovery call and we do our discovery process, one of the parts is interviewing customers. And I often lean into my clients. I go, look, don't give us the customer that's obviously a high potential for churn. Give us the customer that you know literally in the next hour you can call and they'll take our call. That's a customer that trusts you. And more often than not, I don't think C-suite put it this way, but that's only a handful of clients. That's not all the clients. But when they say, do our customers trust us? They'll say all of them do. But when it comes to the people of which can do a customer interview with us, very few and far between. So that's the obvious gap where if they really trusted you and you guys had an amazing relationship, having a 15-minute call with your new marketing team isn't much to ask. And if it is too much to ask, I'd argue that you likely don't have a ton.
That's a very interesting perspective and great point you make there. It would also imply that they see incredible value in what the company is offering, whether it be a product or a service, and that they're almost well and truly embedded within this particular brand. That itself is quite a revelation, I'm sure, to a lot of people. Getting there can be quite a different challenge given the variety of brands that exist out there in the marketplace. How do you help the clients you work with make that mental shift in terms of seeing this as a real possibility, as opposed to going, that's an interesting perspective, but there's just too many companies to really gel with at that level?
I think the easiest thing for me to go back is to explain to them the power of network effects and also the cost of acquisition. I don't think it's new news to anyone that's listening that the cost to acquire a customer is obviously far more expensive than the cost of upselling a customer. So there's an inherent economic question there that's quite obvious, and really just starting from there, I think is usually the first thing that I go to is, look, you know how much it costs to acquire a customer. Why are we not reinvesting 20 to 25% of that cost into making sure that they love us so that not only we can upsell them, right, which is an obvious benefit, but at the same time that you empower the network effect that when you have more people who are evangelists in a very tight network, especially in B2B, like in B2B, we're not selling to 300 runners, we're selling to 30 CTOs, 30 CSOs, 30 CFOs, whatever C-suite you want. And I can guarantee you about 20% of these people, whatever that niche is, run into each other at conferences. And the power of having two people say your name is incredibly powerful. It's almost, to be honest, a sale. And when you don't have an evangelist who's willing to go to a conference and say, hey, I love so-and-so, you're missing out on potential sales. So the idea that you shouldn't invest in them is it's a very simple math game. It's one, you know that it's far more expensive to acquire a customer. Two is it's incredibly cheap to expand your revenue opportunities with a current customer. And three, for a fact that if you can get more customers talking about you, you'll get more sales. So this is a tree that keeps on giving. It's a money tree, and if you don't take care of it, you're just letting it die, and that's fine. And you can continue looking at new names and new logos and expanding that way. But you're really missing out on an opportunity, which is you have a captive audience, and that captive audience will help you sell. It is a marketing channel. Your customers are a marketing channel.
So if I can put this a little bit differently, the goal that you're trying to educate your clients on is to create custom evangelists. Evangelists, would that be correct? Yep.
Evangelists,
right. Again, an interesting thought there. If that is the goal, then that certainly helps put things into a perspective in terms of your packaging and even post-purchase interactions. Would you say that if, as you help your clients think that way, the whole orientation of sales, primarily sales, as well as customer success, certainly changes to creating evangelists and not so much thinking about the revenue that's coming in, but investing for the long term?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the times we think about once a customer is onboarded, you just take care of them. And I think that's a perfectly fine model, but it's becoming more and more apparent that current customers, that's why community building is such a big thing these days, is they're starting to recognize when you have a community, it sells for you. And it sells for you predominantly because people are willing to have a conversation about you. So this idea that sales is just the front end, I think is an older perspective. And I think the newer perspective, especially with changing consumer behaviors, I think it's really important for you to capitalize on what I call high impact, high influence touch points. And a conversation with someone is a high impact, high influence touch point. It's invaluable.
If we're looking to build evangelists and a community that certainly actively, proactively promotes a particular brand, we've certainly touched upon, I guess, the mind shift that needs to occur. What about the heart shift that needs to occur within the organization as well?
The hard shift. The hard shift is letting your marketing people do their job and giving them the opportunity to do that. I think, again, going back to this idea that I certainly believe that we're all at fault for being a little overconfident. I think it's really important for, especially if you are hiring a marketing firm or a marketing resource, to, so long as they're educated and they have the experience to do, to give them the empowerment to do what they need to do so they can do it fast and they can do it well. I think a lot of organizations tie up the resourcing of marketing, and it makes it very hard for them to actually be productive. For example, you're never going to see someone question your SDR every single time they make a phone call. You're not going to interrupt them during your phone call. But for marketing, we'll get people from all parts of the organization comment on the color of a LinkedIn post or comment on a sentence of the third paragraph of an email newsletter. And that makes it very hard for marketing to perform, right? Because the reality is that you perform in every part of your business by making failures. And ideally, I think the best saying I've ever heard, Jim Pattison is a well-known billionaire in Canada. And he says to all of his CEOs, he's like, look, your job is to not bet the house.
Mm.
And if you don't lose the house, I'm fine with that. But just don't bet the house.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. That's your job. And I think that's really the same for every part of your business. But for some reason, marketing, it's like you bet a penny, everyone notices. Salespeople can make 10 bad phone calls and they're fine. But you get one bad email in marketing, it's like everyone knows about it. You got to give the opportunity for marketing to make failures because those are learnings, and those are the learnings that ideally they can.
I would imagine that the hard shift also requires a shift in thinking from the pressures of meeting your quota, at least from a sales point of view, and perhaps even marketing point of view, hitting your quotas every month, to being okay with investing perhaps more in long-term relationships. And I'm curious, given the pressures of business and needing revenue to come in, how are you able to help brands get comfortable with that new equation or balance, so to speak?
I think it's simple. Most of the companies that we ever work with don't necessarily have a repeatable funnel that has any economics tied to it. And it's very easy for me to make the analogy. It's like your sales team didn't either when it first started. And I'm fairly sure that you kept paying them salary for the first 6 months. You didn't fire them in 3 months because it takes far more longer than 3 months for them to even get processed, especially if you didn't have process. So this idea that you expect to have like everyone thinks marketing is so easy. Everyone thinks that marketing is going to drive results in a month. And maybe if you're lucky, it will. Maybe if you hire a marketer who literally comes from a competitor, who literally takes their playbook, likely steals data illegally from their past employer, takes that data, puts it into your Google ads, and you run the exact same funnel, you might be able to get results in a month. I'll argue that. But outside of that, you are likely building a funnel from scratch. And that means it's going to take time for you to iterate. It's going to take time for you to gather data. It's going to take time for you to make changes, make observations. And that's no different than when you hired your first salesperson, or even you as a founder was making your first calls. So the shift is an obvious shift. The problem is that I just think marketing has this preconceived notion that it's easy and that it's fast, which puts us in a terrible position. I almost feel like it's not even repositioning. It's the fact that sales takes time, and marketing is the exact same thing. We are building a funnel from scratch, which means we have to gather data.
Brilliant. And you have talked about investing in things like SEO. Why is that, given all that's happening in our world today, especially with AI and the move towards things like Search GPT and Chat GPT, etc.? Why would you be investing in SEO?
SEO will always be a part of the world, at least in the foreseeable future, probably for the next 4 or 5 years. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the generative AI stuff references organic search. And then the other thing that's really important to know is that search is based on small chains of keywords. Generative AI is predominantly a journey where you're having almost a conversation. And in my opinion, and I don't know if anyone's done this, but I certainly tested this using Perplexity, using ChatGPT. There are very different purposes for them. The other thing that's also an issue with generative AI until they get better at it is also just understanding where they're sourcing their data from. There's an inherent level of discomfort because you are getting a summarized perspective. The problem is you have no idea where that's summarized from sometimes. And I think that's also the reason why I don't think search will go away completely, because you can't live and depend on summarized work all the time. There's a time and place for it. And I think most people who are doing anything important care where their data is being, whatever their reading is, where is it being generated from, because it likely impacts their job. So I still feel will be valuable. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. I do think there will be a full convergence at one point, but I don't think it's going to be this
Mhm.
year or next.
In terms of building a community, things like SEO, I would imagine, would certainly help people find solutions to queries that they have. You're asking brands to be dialed in on their branding and packaging, as you put it, in order to create first impressions that would connect or resonate with them. How do we go from there to creating community? What sorts of things do you find tend to capture people's interest, put their hand up and say, yes, I'm willing to stay in touch with you in order to learn more and be on this journey, so to speak, with you?
I think capturing community is not a science because it bridges on personal time. And if you look at life through like the economics curve of substitution costs, the reality is that our entire life is run with different decisions that are basically based on substitution costs. And the substitution cost is at 6 p.m. Are you going to go to a community event run by a commercial intent business, or are you going to go see your friend for coffee? And the only way you can do that is if you fulfill a need that is greater than just a social connection and a commercial connection, but also a personal connection. And what I'm trying to say here is that when you want to build a community that is actually tight knit, you have to give that individual the outcomes of not only being personally fulfilled, socially fulfilled, and commercially fulfilled all at the same time with a level of consistency. And when you do that, then you have a community. The reason why you have a community is because, yeah, they love their friend, but they don't get a commercial benefit
Mm-hmm.
out of it. But when they come to your event, not only do they make friends, they feel good and they also learn something. So now the substitution cost makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. They get more out of it. And that's why I think community building, while sounds great and potentially sounds easy, it's really not because it's very specific to programming.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've recognized in my life is there's actually not a lot of people who know how to program great events
Yeah.
because there's a lot of small details that people don't think about. I call it one of the things that we do for events is I call it the awkward turtle problem. And people are like, what does that even mean, Nate? And I go, look, to me, the best event is where there's no awkward turtles. And people then again go, what does that mean? And I go, look, at every event, you always know there are a couple people that don't know what to do with themselves. They don't feel
Mm-hmm.
comfortable to engage in the conversation. They feel by themselves. They're hovering around the coffee machine and they're just awkward because they don't know who to talk to. They don't feel socially involved. And if you want the best programming is how do you prevent having no awkward turtles? And if you can do that, you have an amazing event, which likely means you're very inclusive, you have engagements, you have icebreakers, and at the end of the day, you also want people to be able to say, hey, I would invite other people in the industry to this event, and then you have a win. I'm oversimplifying it with the awkward turtle problem, but there's definitely a lot of programming challenges in order for you to have a successful event, which it means also having a successful community.
Could you give us an example of perhaps an event you've attended that's hit these key indicators as you've described them?
Yeah, I took 50 CEOs of companies that were doing more than $5 to $10 million a year in revenue to axe throwing.
Okay.
And people were like, that's an interesting thing. I was like, yeah, what did I do? It's I made everyone awkward. And when you make everyone awkward, no one feels awkward because it's not like everyone goes to that event and goes, yeah, I've thrown axes all my life. Maybe like one of them, I think the two people in the entire crowd did, but everyone was on the same playing field. So there was this natural connection
Mm-hmm.
people made. So not only one did I invest into getting a community of people who were of the same seniority, I gave them an event where essentially no one had an ego because I forced them into an activity that had nothing to do with their business and they all sucked at it. And so what that ended up doing was allowing all these individuals who had to be paired up to be forced into conversations in an activity of which neither of them were good at, which then created social
Mhm.
bonding. So not only did they get social bonding, they got a commercial value because of all the individuals they met, they were people of similar size or nature of their business. And at the same time, it was personally fulfilling because they learned how to axe thorough. So when you combine all these things, you get a great event. And when you do it enough time, people come back, and you don't have to put that much effort into it to get them to come back again. So a lot of it is really just thinking about the social dynamics that happen at events and making sure you manage them very well.
Thank you for sharing that example as well. In your experience, what have you found that brands often trip over in terms of maximizing trust and customer retention?
I think again, it just goes back to they're tripping over on the fact that they're not taking care of their customers.
Okay.
I think they're overconfident that they just don't invest in them.
And does that mean they're not communicating as regularly, or is it something else?
They're not measuring it enough. They're not investing enough. They're not willing to put more people behind their
Right.
current customers. They think about it as a loss leader in the sense that, look, we've already made money from them. Why do we have to keep investing into them? I think often companies just really overlook that.
Okay. And in terms of scaling marketing teams from scratch, I believe we've had quite a bit of experience with that. What advice would you give CEOs or founders who are just beginning to build out their marketing function?
With a 95% probability, I'll say that if you're not a marketing person and you try to hire your first marketing person, you're going to be incredibly disappointed with the results. That's likely because you are expecting far too much from your first marketing person. It is very unlikely if you don't have a full function or a process for a single marketing person to do well. Incredibly unlikely. And you will likely only see economies of scale of your marketing function when you can afford to have about 3 FTEs, 3 full-time employees. If you can't afford 3 FTEs and you hire a single marketing person, I can guarantee you that becomes a very reactive function. And it's going to be an individual of which is likely inefficient to tactically execute on everything that you need reactively. So you have a reactive function that is likely not what you want. You probably want a proactive function, and you likely have now a person who is reactively creating work inefficiently. So that's just a disaster for you being upset and likely you wasting a ton of time hoping for some reason a single person is going to fix your problems. It's unlikely that a single person will fix your problems. So I really tell a lot of companies, you are better off with agencies. You are better off finding someone who is a specialist in maybe a tactic of which you've already identified. Example, a search ad marketing firm, an event marketing firm, a community building marketing firm, a strategic partnership marketing firm, whatever you decide is you think is your highest probability activity, or hiring someone like ourselves, which is a firm that builds your marketing team for you, where we are a proactive firm, where we are essentially building out your strategy and executing on it. And doing that because we have economies of scale, right? We have full-time copywriters. We have proper digital media buyers. We have proper creative people. We have proper operations. So you're never going to find a single employee who can do more than us. No.
And with brands that are perhaps in a bit of a red ocean type environment, there's a lot of competition. How would you encourage them to think about breaking through the noise in order to build a lasting impression and drive growth?
I tell them you're in a red ocean, and unless you want to be blood in the ocean, the middle is where you go to die. So make a choice. And what I mean by that is I think often when any company does their marketing, they often, again, overconfident. They think that when they make a mistake or they're too aggressive in their creatives, that everyone's going to notice. But realistically, no one really does because, one, you don't have enough budget for you to distribute that content far enough and wide enough and frequent enough for anyone to care. You're just doing yourself a disfavor. So I think a lot of times companies are just too shy about being bold. I told one of our companies we're using memes. They're like, why? I was like, no one cares. No one cares about your business. No one cares about your industry. You're boring, you're dry, and the people that read your stuff are IT people. So, for the love of God, we're just going to do something fun because if it's funny, at least people are going to talk about it. And you're the only one that's going to do something fun. So, I think there's this perspective where we have to do the trend, which is be commercial, be business oriented, or something rather, and you tread this cautious line of being very conservative. But all you're doing yourself is a disfavor. You're just being boring and you're just being like everyone else. So if you're in a red ocean, which means you got a lot of competition, You're doing exactly what your competition is doing. You're not standing out. So why don't you just stop doing what you're doing and just save money then? Because it's going to be kind of.
You've shared quite a few great points there. Thank you for that. When it comes to this idea of incorporating packaging and trust into B2B brands, is there perhaps a couple of aspects that you find doesn't get much airtime, doesn't get talked about very much? If so, what would they be?
I think it's actually the logical connection between building trust is about having authenticity, empathy, and logic. And I don't think companies understand how to use empathy well enough.
Okay.
And empathy basically means it's funny because if you look at it from a marketing perspective, we always talk about pain points, benefits. That's empathy. And I think a lot of companies aren't empathetic enough. And you see this in every part of the organization. And you especially see this in sales, right? We forget that we're talking to a human. We forget that they have very specific problems that they want to be heard on. I think a lot of businesses that don't do well are just not empathetic enough.
You make a great point there. I'd be curious, how do you help them come to that realization that perhaps they don't have empathy sorted as yet?
I think it's a great I think that's a great question. I was working with a company that was dealing with real estate, and I came into this company and had this weird rule where they're like, we only call people who live in the units residents. And I was like, but they're renters. And they're like, no, they're residents. I was like, no, they're renters. And they're like, no, we can't use that term. That's mean. And I was like, have you ever heard anyone go to their friend group and be like, hey guys, has anyone become a resident recently? Hey John, are you a resident of your house? It's not like common language. And I literally just asked them, I was like, why are we not just using what they call themselves, which is renters? And they're like, oh, that's just a rule. I was like, who made this rule? And no one could answer me. And that's just, I think for me, it's just honestly finding just terrible mistakes like this, where I go, if you can't explain it, it's not a rule. But for some reason, we're still using it. And that clearly means you guys have no idea what you're doing. And it clearly means that you're not empathetic. It means you're not thinking about this from a customer perspective. You're just thinking about it from your ego. You're thinking about how you can solve their problems your way. You need to solve their problems the way they want it to be solved. And for me, it's not that hard to showcase that. I think it's fairly easy, but mind you, this is my job. Yeah, I think it's very easy for me to find very specific instances where I go, you're not talking in customer language. You're talking in your language.
Brilliant. We've covered a fair bit of ground here, Nathan. If you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
My top takeaway is that if you're listening to this and you care about marketing, I can almost guarantee you that there is a marketing tactic right now in your organization that you've likely underutilized. And this constant chase for the shiny object is a waste of your time. Unless you're a 100 million ARR business, you've likely not maximized a channel that's already working for you. Maybe that channel is not the most scalable channel, but at least you know it's going to work. At least if you double down your money, you'll likely double your leads. The biggest takeaway I would tell for anyone that's listening is to stop reinventing the wheel. You have a wheel that works, and I can guarantee you haven't over-engineered it yet. So over-engineer before you start looking at trying to reinvent the wheel.
Great. Thank you again for that. If listeners are curious, want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
You can find me at our website, which is www.findyouraudience.online, and or find me on LinkedIn. I should be the only major marketing person on there, but I could be wrong.
We'll include links to that in the show notes. Nathan, thank you so much for this. It's been incredibly insightful.